conscious of the time, I just conclude with one very beautiful story, one of my favorite stories that I share often. One of the most famous kings of the Ghaznavid era. It was a dynasty that ruled a lot of Iran, Persia, and the northern part of the Indian subcontinent. And one of the famous kings of the Ghaznavid era was a man by the name of Mahmood Ghaznavi. And he had a very famous Turkish slave called Ayaz. Many of you have heard of the stories of Mahmood and Ayaz. There are many, many stories, famous stories about Mahmood and Ayaz. But Ayaz was a Turkish servant slave of Mahmood's. But they became really, really close, to the point where Ayaz climbed up in the ranks, to a point where now he was given governorship of a certain area. And there were those, as you can imagine, who were envious of Ayaz. This guy was a slave, Turkish slave. He's now climbed up the ranks and is almost like the right-hand man of Mahmood Ghaznavi. And so there were people who were opposed to Ayaz. They were jealous, who were envious. So one day they came to Mahmood and they said to him, Ayaz has stolen from you. He has a lot of treasures and ornaments that he has hidden in a room in the castle or in the palace. So they sowed these seeds of doubt in Mahmood's mind. And they said to him, every morning, Ayaz goes into this room. Nobody's allowed to enter the room. He goes into the room for a little while, and then he comes back out again, and then he does his business for the day. So Mahmood said to them, finally now he was beginning to doubt what's going on. Why is this a daily routine of Ayaz's? That every day he goes into this room, nobody's allowed to go in, it's a secretive room. So he says to them that tomorrow, when Ayaz comes to see me, I want you to go in the room and see what's inside the room. So the next day, when Ayaz comes to see Mahmood, these two individuals, they go in, they break through the door, and they go into the room and they see two things. They see a pair of cotton clothes, some clothing, and a pair of leather slippers. That's it. So now they're convinced that the treasure is buried. So they begin digging. There's nothing. After a while, they come back to Mahmood and they say to him, we found nothing other than this cotton shirt and a pair of leather slippers. So now Mahmood turns to Ayaz and he says to him, what was so special, or what is so special about this room that nobody is allowed to go into it? And there's nothing in the room, only a cotton shirt and a pair of leather slippers. So what does Ayaz say to him? Ayaz says to him, these are my clothes and slippers when I was a slave. That I had nothing but this, a cotton shirt and a pair of leather slippers. Every day I remind myself that this is my beginning and everything that I have is yours, that you have given it to me as a loan. The only thing that belongs to me is this cotton shirt and this pair of leather slippers. I remind myself to bring me down to a level of humility and humbleness before I begin to serve. Mu'mineen, that is what sajda is all about. It is a recognition that everything that we have in this world is from Him. It needs to create that sense of humbleness, humility in the human being. Allama Iqbal, in his Allama Iqbal got a lot of famous works, but in his work Shikwa and then Jawab Shikwa, in Shikwa, he has these famous lines about Mahmood and Ayaz. He says, आ गया ऐन लड़ाई में अगर वक्त नमाज क़िबलरू होके ज़मी बोस हुई कौम हिजाज. That even at the time, the prime time of battle, ऐन वक्त लड़ाई, at the prime time of battle, when it became time for namaz, the Qawm of Hijaz, the people of Hijaz, stood facing Qibla and put their heads down into sajda. एक ही सफ में खड़े हो गए महमूद और अयाज, न कोई बंदा रहा न कोई बंदा नवाज. That in one line stood Mahmood and Ayaz, master and slave. न कोई बंदा रहा न कोई बंदा नवाज. Nobody was master, nobody was slave when they stood before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. बंदो साहिबो मोहताजो गनी एक हुए. बंदो साहिबो मोहताजो गनी एक हुए. तेरी सरकार में आए तो सभी एक हुए. That at that time when they stood before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there was no distinction. Slave and master, rich and poor, all became one. When they came before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they all became one. 5 times a day, mu'mineen, we are in that situation where we bow down our heads in worship and in prostration to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the message for this evening is this: that the challenge for myself first is that the act of sajda is not supposed to be an act of me just physically putting my head down on the ground. The act of sajda is supposed to create that change within me, an appreciation and understanding that I am putting my most prized part of my body, my face, to the ground, rubbing my forehead on the dust, acknowledging that I am nothing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's an act of utmost submission. There is no other way to be more submissive to the Master than putting your head down the sajda. But the act of sajda requires not only that physical act of prostration, but that submission of the heart in which we acknowledge from our very being that we have nothing, that we are nothing.